Welcome. So we are now going to turn to a study of the subversion of the subject essay from the Ecrit, which I believe was published in 1960. Is that correct? Subversion of the subject in the Dialectic of Desire. So I like to think of this one as effectively the coda of Lacanian thought. I mean, there's sort of the essay that you send to somebody who, if when they're done with it, they're not convinced as to the thoroughness, to the rigor, to the systematic nature of the Lacanian system as a system precisely, then forget about it. Lacan's not for them, you know? Um, it is remarkable to read this essay in part, and maybe even unheimlich in the sense of all of its references are to things that are about like sort of the fundamental constitution of reality for the subject's relationship to the fantasy, how enjoyment has a structural function that sort of produces an excess that is then quantitatively able to be mapped onto the division of the subject. And um, if anything, the problem with this essay and why people probably would be afraid of it, if that's the right word, or sort of pestered by it, would be found in it's too precise, right? So that is the maddening aspect of it. One understands Lacan's point about every subject as a subject of psychosis after they've sort of attempted to read this in some sense. Um, so it's very good. I found Tupanamba's collectives, the notes from Pensée from back from like 2011 to 2014, extremely helpful. I shared that with y'all in the Discord. I would recommend it. Um, Looking at the overall length, I think probably we will have to do this in 2 or 3 sessions, as we did with Kant with Sod. And yeah, I think it will also, frankly, dovetail pretty nicely with some of these work we're doing on the Kopjek film analysis work. So obviously, it starts with a great deal of philosophical speculation that I find actually extremely useful for how schematic it is. Because we often talk about, oh, Lacan's relationship to Kojève, Lacan's relationship to Hegel, Lacan's relationship to Copernicus, and so on. But here it is sort of nicely correlated to like knowledge, truth, and then this split. Uh, so, anyways, I don't want to like give too many prefatory remarks. I think our best bet is to jump right in. Maybe before we jump right in, why don't people just briefly share? Andrew shared Sam McCormick's lectures, which I found very enjoyable. I mean, in a sense, he was just spending quite a lot of time to understand this fundamental distinction um, between the subject of enunciation, right? And the like what's the other one? Subject of enunciation
And
and the
the
subject
subject of the enunciated or of the
of
statement.
the enunciated.
Yeah.
So that I found cool because he helped me understand the elementary movement of the first portrayal of the graph of desire. Um, but did you notice that he didn't spend much time on the philosophical or the introduction of the scientific points at the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's some of like the key things that like Sam is not so like savvy in. I think maybe he's just sort of like lacking in is that philosophical aspect.
Yeah, but where he is superior is precisely in this. I mean, it is ironic that he's a coach of Lacanian psychoanalysts, not, and he's not an analyst. That is remarkable
Yeah, it's very
because he does have, I don't want to call it self-help, but he does have some type of I don't know, like secular preacher self-help accessible mode of conveying ideas from Lacan that are pretty pretty remarkable. So anyways, I was looking at those resources. Matilda shared a helpful point as it pertains to this some of these linguistic definitions, as we understand the erasure of the I and this idea of the operator and some of these other sort of terms that are less frequently invoked in Lacan that actually come from like Jakobson and from Saussure and from structural linguistics, right? Okay. Are there other resources that folks want to throw onto the table? Luis, what have you been reading to prepare for this?
Not much. I just was reading all the text. Um, I think some background is that if you check the date, this is at the end of seminar 7. So at the end
Seven.
of the ethics of psychoanalysis, he presents this this is a this is a presentation in a conference, right? So yeah, so it is much in these periods of the symbolic. Let's say that we can situate this work.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, this one helpful exercise is to track down the reference to uh where it was I come into being as a structural formula elaborated in the 1900 Interpretations of Dream essay regarding the dream of the dead father. There's this, it's worth maybe in the Discord to read Freud on that so we understand this logic of retroactivity as well. That might be a good exercise for us. Um, Andrew?
It's Ellie, actually.
Oh,
Um, I know there's the Reading a Cree book as
yeah.
well, and I have the PDFs of actually all of the ones that have been published so far that I can add to the Discord. Um, I think they can be kind of basic, and helpful at kind of getting at some of just those basic concepts.
Yeah.
But there's also the lesson from seminar 6, well, the first like 2, 3 lessons from seminar 6 where Lacan goes on about the graph of desire and then also the dream of the dead father,
Hmm.
that's being referenced here.
Yeah, in a more abridged way than entirely of seminar 5.
Yeah, like he kind of recaps in a way that I think is helpful.
Yeah, because it requires a lot, right? It requires an understanding of Hegel's theory of negation. It requires an understanding of Freud's theory of negation because there's like a double negation going on. And it actually, there's these layers to it that are, you can get lost in a maze extremely quickly. So let's just be cautious of that. Right? So, yeah, let's be careful on there. But I think we should jump in. Unless there's any other thoughts before we. Elizabeth, you've been doing some background research as well.
I have. I've been reading Finks, reading it pretty closely,
Nice.
which is I don't know how I feel about his interpretation of absolute knowing or absolute knowledge.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I guess we can get into that. And then Philippe von Hot's Against Adaptation, which is
Mm,
a line by line close reading.
mm.
And I think I shared the link in the Discord of that.
That's amazing. So when we get to this point on absolute knowing, you can maybe jump in on that.
Maybe. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, at least tell us why you find an error perhaps in Fink's interpretation.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Matan, are you ready? And does everyone have? I am looking at the English translation, page 671. Green light on that? Sick. All right. Well, maybe we could try to scansion our time together around 7:45, only because of getting ready for holiday purposes. Is that reasonable? Okay. Because again, we're going to take it slow and we'll do all. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm a little giddy, frankly. Matan, are you indeed ready to begin or what?
Mhm.
All right, kick it off, man.
Sure, so we're reading the Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire in the Freudian unconscious. There's a little preface here. This text represents my contribution, my being Lacan, to a conference on La Dialectique held at Royaumont from September 19th to 23rd, 1960. The conference was organized by, in English, the International Colloquium for Philosophy, and I was invited to participate by Jean Wall. It is the date of this text which predates the Bonneval colloquium, from which the text that follows stems, position of the unconscious, follows this one in a Cree 1966 that leads me to publish it in order to give the reader an idea how far my teaching has always been ahead of what I could make more widely available. A little parenthetical paragraph here. The graph presented here was constructed for my seminar on unconscious formations. It was worked out particularly in relation to the structure of jokes, which I took as a point of departure before a surprised audience. That was in the first term of the seminar, which was the last term of 1957. An account of the seminar, along with the graph provided here, was published at the time in the Psychological Bulletin. A structure, and I'm beginning now the actual essay, a structure is constitutive of the praxis known as psychoanalysis. This structure cannot be immaterial to an audience like the one here today, which is supposed to be philosophically sophisticated. The thesis that being a philosopher means being interested in what everyone is interested in without knowing it has the interesting peculiarity that its relevance does not imply that it can be settled either way, just because one is interested in it. For it can only be settled if everyone becomes a philosopher, so everyone must be interested in it. I'm talking about its philosophical relevance, for that is, in the end, the schema Hegel gave us of history in the phenomenology of mind. And I think that kind of amounts to something like a higher order class struggle, which we can refer to as structuring all these, lower order events. Summarizing it in this way has the advantage of providing us with a mediation that is convenient for situating the subject on the basis of a relationship to knowledge. It is also convenient for demonstrating the ambiguity of such a relationship. This same ambiguity is manifested by the effects of science in the contemporary universe. And I'll give my own little reading, particularly of its effects on the body, occurring due to discourse. The scientist himself is a subject, one who is particularly qualified in his constitution, as is shown by the fact that science did not come into the world all by itself. Its birth was not without vicissitudes and was preceded by a number of failures, abortion or prematurity. Now, this subject, who must know what he is doing, or so we presume, does not know what is already in fact of interest to everyone regarding the effects of science, or so it would appear in the contemporary universe, where everyone finds himself at the same level as the scientist, as far as this point of ignorance is concerned. In and of itself, this warrants our speaking of a subject of science, a notion to which an epistemology that can be said to display more pretension than success would like to measure up. Hence, let it be noted here the entirely didactic reference I have made to Hegel in order to convey, for my analytic training purposes, where things stand regarding the question of the subject, such as psychoanalysis properly subverts it. What qualifies me to proceed along this path is obviously my experience of this praxis. What made me decide to do so, those who follow my work will attest to this, is a failure of theory coupled with abuses in its transmission which, while presenting no danger to the praxis itself, result in both cases in a total absence of scientific status. To raise the question of the minimal conditions required for such a status was not perhaps an impertinent point of departure. It has turned out to lead a long way. I am not referring here to anything as broad in scope as a challenging of different societies' practices, in particular to the stockpile of conclusions I have been forced to draw in order to counter the notorious deviations in analytic praxis that claim to be genuinely psychoanalytic in England and America. What I will specifically try to define is subversion, and I apologize to this assembly, whose qualifications I mentioned earlier, for being unable to do more in its presence than elsewhere namely to take this assembly as such as the pivot of my demonstration, the onus being on me to justify taking such liberties with regard to it. Nevertheless, I shall take advantage of your kindness, and assuming we agree that a scientific, pardon me, I lost my spot. Label by the name of psychology. And I challenge this precisely because, as I will show, the function of the subject, as inaugurated by Freudian experience, disqualifies from the outset what, going by the name psychology, merely perpetuates an academic framework, no matter how one dresses up its premises. Its criterion is the unity of the subject, which is one of the presuppositions of this sort of psychology. It should even be taken as symptomatic that this theme is ever more emphatically isolated, as if the return of a certain subject of consciousness, connaissance, were at stake, or as if the psychical had to obtain recognition as doubling the organism. Here we must take as exemplary the idea in which a whole body of traditional thought comes together in accrediting a term, state of consciousness, that is not without basis. Whether we're dealing with the states of enthusiasm, eudaimonia described by Plato, the degrees of samadhi in Buddhism, or the experience, erlebnis, one has under the influence of hallucinogens, it is important to know how much of this is authenticated by any theory. Lewis, please.
Yeah, I think we have covered a lot, so maybe we should break up. But here, I think there is crucial. I don't understand why Fink used this translation of consciousness, because it's not the same as connaissance. In the French, of course, there is knowledge is divided between savoir, connaissance, right? And connaissance here. I mean, in English, I think there is a word cognizance, right, which is related to knowledge through cognition, right? So, and this is something that, then again, when he talks about state of consciousness in the French, again, this is connaissance. And you will see that he makes a lot of distinctions between savoir, connaissance, because it goes back to the idea of cognition, right? The knowledge that comes from cognition, right? And this is irrelevant when he talks about the empirical sciences of psychology, right? That it is based on cognition, right? So there is already a division between knowledge, that is the savoir, and this connaissance that comes from cognition. Of course, this has a relevance to his theory of the mirror stage, right? It's a knowledge of identity that comes from cognition, right? So every time that he talks about connaissance, he refers to that, and it's important to notice the difference. And again, I don't understand why he uses consciousness. It has nothing to do with consciousness.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for that. Andrew, did you want to jump in? Or, sorry, I keep on saying just Andrew. I need to think of one name for both of you that can encapsulate you both. We'll think of that later. That will come to us.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even bother to take that into account what Luis said, but that is true. There is a distinction between connaissance, which he's been saying since as early as like function, field, and seminar 1, and the
I think the thing that's driving to it,
Yeah.
right, is a distinction between the subject of knowledge at the level of imaginary
yeah,
and the subject of knowledge as savoir at the level of symbolic,
yeah,
right? And so I think that there's this recurring conversation about knowledge as connaissance in relationship to a particular theory of Hegelian recognition and a particular phenomenological theory of the ascertainment of knowledge vis-a-vis a theory of recognition of consciousness.
yeah. I mean, and that's exactly what the imaginary investment is in the early seminars. It is a struggle of recognition and rivalry. Especially in analytic experience, this is what happens when the analytic intervention is treated on the imaginary plane. To use plane, sort of lightly, because these aren't like dimensions, but just sort of, orientations, we could say structural orientations.
Sure.
What I wanted to point out was like, the entire beginning about science and, like, and all that, I've been like obsessed with Milner's text on science and Lacan, but I think it's interesting how he compares both the subject of science and scientific discourse and inquiry with that of like the Hegelian movement in the phenomenology, from sense certainty to self-consciousness to oriented around knowledge. Because with science, for him, at least for Lacan, he's not only focusing on like discourse of science or a core doctrine of science, but the way that it's advented by a modern subject, which is the cogito. And it's both phantasmatic and also paranoiac. At least the knowledge or the connaissance that science is operating with is paranoiac. And you could see this, he talks about this in Seminar 9, but why he's so fascinated about the cogito and its advent of the modern subject is because it's around the first meditation of the discourse on method, where Descartes states that, Lacan will sum it up as I am thinking and I am not, which is this formula off of a vanishing point in Descartes' argumentation, where he says he is thinking, aka he is doubting, because he believes he's under the deception of a deceitful God, right? And so this right here, I think, marks the decisive moment of which the subject of science, which tries to neutralize itself from its experimentation, is also invested into a phantasmatic and even paranoiac understanding of knowledge.
Well, I think it's also against a pragmatist reading of Hegel, or a grounding of the scientific or scientificity or scientific authority of psychoanalysis as you have in America through this pragmatist prism, which would be seeking to ground it vis-a-vis experience. Yeah. Which he does not qualify as science. And I think this is the Kojevian point regarding what is the subject in Hegel's phenomenology. It is the subject of science. It's not the subject of experience. Right?
Right, because it's already mediated in Hegel's notion of
it's like a misunderstanding of Hegel's subject. In some sense, he wants to clarify. Okay, fabulous. So yes, go ahead.
But it's not disconnected, because later on in some pages he will refer back to how because in phenomenology, right, it starts with perception, right, and self-certainty.
I didn't hear what you said. In phenomenology?
In the phenomenology, it starts with perception, right, and self-certainty. Right, so it is always related to the perception of an object, right? And then also when it comes to the idea of the master-slave dialectic, comes back to negating the object, external object, right? This is why the negation that we're talking about is not the same in psychoanalysis, and that's why it is not the same dialectical process of Hegelianism. And well, he will talk about that later, right? So
yeah, that's true.
There's already a difference that he's making, that right, that we're not talking about connaissance, right? This is not the knowledge of science, or at least how he sees that science is progressing. But he claims that the dialectical method is not able to explain the scientific, the new scientific revelations, right? There is something else going on. So yeah, there's a misunderstanding at the level of reducing Hegel to this subject of cognition, but it's not. There is still something relevant about that, right?
Okay, yeah, it's still. I mean, we're talking about something that's in the middle of being fully fleshed out, which is always problematic in some sense. But Jonas, and then Matilda, and then we'll go back to the book.
What you just said is a kind of what I was trying to get at, is that I think maybe any ambiguity around the term consciousness and connaissance might just be the fact that he's starting off the essay. I mean, like, well, this is page 3. So like it's not differentiated. It's nice and broad. But maybe to tie it into what Andrew was saying, the cogito is kind of relevant here. In what's his name? Rorty's book, The Mirror of Nature, he references Ryle. I haven't actually read Ryle, but what he says is that Ryle's critique of Descartes is that too much is put under the cogito, like emotions and cognitions. That's too much, he says. But maybe Descartes' point is that, yeah, actually, there's quite a lot that's what's not physical, or what's not extended. So maybe we're kind of still trapped in like finding out what is within the cogito, scientific or otherwise. So those were
Yeah.
my thoughts.
Yeah. And we haven't even introduced the category of enjoyment and whether and how it is excluded from the
Right. Once
subject
we
of
get to
knowledge.
the Copernican step, you know, that's where
Yeah.
we start to get things moving. You know?
Can Cartesianism incorporate jouissance? Something we will examine. Okay. Matilda, and then we will read.
Yeah, I feel like the distinction of like whatever is happening with Lacan's um, investigation as opposed to empiricism, I feel like the sentence that a science cannot be conditioned. He's telling the crowd that I shall take advantage of your kindness, and assuming we agree that a science cannot be conditioned upon empiricism. And I feel like coming from like a Marxist background, like there is an emphasis on empiricism and like the whole, I don't know, like Baconian tradition going into like, I don't know, the science that like Darwin and stuff, like that's like English empiricism. And so it's difficult to like detach myself from like thinking about the organism and whatever, like how science was founded for, you know, hundreds of years before this, like empiricism was so important to like casting out the idols of the mind that kept progress or enlightenment from proceeding. So it is interesting that it is like taken advantage of, that there, it doesn't need to, I'm curious what the argument even is that science cannot be conditioned upon empiricism. That, you know, and then of course, like going on, there's like the other psychologies take for granted the unity of the subject, and I think find the goal of their what their sciences as a fully conscious subject. I was reading like and how like the psychologist or the expert or the master is supposed to like take you on a rite of passage to like a full experience of consciousness in a certain way.
Yeah, or even the fact that analytic philosophers, when they read Plato, do not draw a difference between truth and knowledge.
Sure. Yeah.
It's very odd. It's actually like once you read Lacan and then you like you read Plato differently, and then you step into these analytic philosophy departments, and it actually seems quite boring because they don't have that like, and that's the division of Badiou. Like Badiou's reading of Plato is determined by this split between knowledge and truth. They're not equivalent. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, it is interesting, like, that he's referring to these states of enthusiasm or experience, and like maybe like to know psychology would be to experience all of the states, to have a full conception of the human psychology. I've been reading some Jung, and that is a part of
and
his.
Isn't Jung referenced in a moment?
He is.
Yeah.
I'll comment later.
Right. And sorry, what were you saying about your readings of?
Oh, like part of like how he presents his text is like, I'm going to induce in the reader an experience of something profound by going through this operation. And so there is, you know, just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Akshay, please.
This is just an association in relation to what Matilda was just pointing out. Like I was watching the Stephen Holgate Science of Logic lectures. The second lecture, he has this, Hegel accuses Kant of being empirical. And the accusation is that because Kant sort of starts off from the finitude of the human subject, and Hegel wants to, through dialectic, sort of demonstrate the arrival at certainty, right? Like, and I think again, there's nothing in this that seems to suggest that, but like part of what we were just talking about, like maybe science, certainty, and dialectic have that connection here with like what Kant accuses of being an empirical in, sorry, what am I saying? What Hegel accuses Kant of in terms of being empirical is that like these 12 categories of cognition, they're sort of just given, right? Like, but there's no kind of like attempt to trace the derivation of these into like why these 12 categories and not some other set of categories, right? Like, and Hulgate's interpretation is sort of that it's because Kant believes in finitude. And so Kant just takes it for granted that there can never be this kind of certainty. There can't, in fact, as opposed to which, like, yeah, anyway, it's just something I wanted to throw out.
Very rich. Very, very good. Very good. Very good. Okay, fabulous. So let us
You mind if I say one thing real quick
yeah.
regarding what we've been talking about to sum it up? I think it's just because I mean, Ellie was pointing out earlier about the emphasis of psychology being put into question, and it made me think, well, regarding science and his claim that it can't be conditioned upon empiricism. Well, this is an extreme example of science kind of being so, for lack of a better term, because I can't think of anything, infantile in the sense where even though it would like to be grounded on the scientific method or in empirical, quote unquote, reality, it has to start with the presupposition of the unity of a subject or the unity of a mind, right? Some conceptual presupposition that there is a unified mind. And the last thing I'll just say, so we get back to the text, is that when we're like, again, thinking about like, not even Lacan's notion of science, but even like the French thinking theory of science per se is based upon kind of like what Conrad said in our Althusser group about the consistency of axiomatization, as well as for what Milner says about Lacan's use of structural linguistics during this period. He likes this theory of science of minimalist theory, object minimalism, and property minimalism. And so this is where you can't ground linguistics necessarily on a method of empiricism, but it doesn't mean that it's less of any science than like, an empirical science or a social science. Its criteria is different from the pure empiricist method.
And I will say, since I was evoked just now, that if you think about like psychological science at this point in time, the main tradition that was kind of taking over was behaviorism, which Lacan does critique at various points. But the very strict behaviorists don't even talk about cognition at all as such. Like they're so focused on behavior as the only like observable phenomenon of an organism that they ignore cognition or emotion or any of these other psychological components entirely. And so I wonder if that's also something that he's kind of pointing to here, that like if we're taking this behaviorist tradition and we're looking at that as like empirical science because it's observable, that that's a pretty, I mean, I think that sentence Matilda brought up about how a science cannot be conditioned upon empiricism, like he's actually directly refuting the point of the behaviorists there.
I think a case could be made. There's multiple culprits and traditions that are being thrown into this empiricist bucket, without question, ego psychology included, and its presuppositions to a unified ego and things of that nature. And of course, it does remind me of this essay that I recently wrote on Althusser in relationship to Jacques Rancière's beautiful phrase, which was that for the Marxists in the cultural air, in the wake of this intervention in the 1960s, the meaning of subversion was used to subvert the scientific basis of Marxist-Leninism in such a way whereby the worker was thought to, and this is why like figures like Kluskard thought that the entire ontology of Lacan was thought in a kind of pre-productive sphere in some sense, precisely because the snag of language, this like Thomistic or St. Augustinian sin of language, mires the worker in a condition which is even more fatal than exploitation. And then, therefore, the Marxist savant, the Marxist theorist, can easily scrap, which they already wanted to do because of other reasons having to do with Stalin, the scientific legitimacy of Marxist-Leninism. That's something like Rancière's argument in short, maybe in very rough forms. I'm obviously not too convinced by it, or to the extent that I think that that's a problem. I think that what's required is like some careful work about the rapprochement between Marx and Lacan. Maybe much more care than is usually brought to bear, especially with a figure like Zizek, who would absolutely adopt the Lacanian subject against Marxism any day. So that would be something for us maybe perhaps to consider at the end. And I know that Rancière's point was about this sort of, I mean, it would be interesting to ask, why subversion is isolated so centrally.
On this point, like I think the term like fully conscious and like an immanent, there's an immanentism that is brought up later, and like I think it does in some ways resonate with like Marxist class consciousness ideas.
I do too. I do too. I don't want to discard
in that it's
it.
being like directly criticized as we continue here. Like,
oh, really?
It seems possible that like this sense of like empiricism and like the desire for a fully conscious subject as a goal.
Yes.
And like the term immanentism that comes up later, I think we should keep Marxism in mind as that.
And the whole construct of the savant and so on, right? And méconnaissance itself, and structural ignorance, and the relationship to the fantasy and all of that. One does have to ask how we extract or maybe even abstract lessons for collective subjectivity. Questions about subjectivity at a collective point of view would be something I think is useful for our work in some ways, given that most of us are not psychoanalysts. Maybe a couple of us are. But anyways, Matan, please continue.
It is clear that Hegelian knowledge in the logicizing Aufhebung, sublation on which it is based, puts as little stock in these states as such as does modern science, which may recognize in them an object of experience in the sense of an opportunity to define certain coordinates, but in no way an ascesis that could, so to speak, be epistemogenic or neuphoric. It is in this respect that reference to them is relevant to us. For I assume you are sufficiently informed about Freudian practice to realize that such states play no part in it. But what is not fully appreciated is the fact that this supposed depth psychology does not dream of using these states to obtain illumination, for example, or even assign any value to them along the path it sketches out. Or that is why, though it is not stressed, Freud steers clear of hypnoid states, even when it comes to explaining the phenomena of hysteria. That is the amazing thing. Freud prefers the hysterics discourse to hypnoid states. What I have called fertile moments in my mapping of paranoiac knowledge is not a Freudian reference. I have some difficulty in getting across in a circle infatuated with the most incredible illogicality what it means to interrogate the unconscious as I do. That is to the point at which it gives a reply that is not some sort of ravishment or takedown, but is rather a saying why. If we conduct the subject anywhere, it is to a deciphering which assumes that a sort of logic is already operative in the unconscious. A logic in which, for example, an interrogative voice or even the development of an argument can be recognized. The whole psychoanalytic tradition supports the view that the analyst's voice can intervene only if it enters at the right place, and that if it comes too early, it merely produces a closing up. In other words, a strain of psychoanalysis that is sustained by its allegiance to Freud cannot, under any circumstances, pass itself off as a rite of passage to some archetypal or, in some sense, ineffable experience. The day someone who is not simply a moron obtains a hearing for a view of this kind will be the day all limits will have been abolished. We are still a long way from that. Thus far, we have merely broached our subject, for we must home in more precisely on what Freud himself articulates in his doctrine as constituting a Copernican step. For such a step to be constituted, is it enough that a privilege should be revoked, in this case the one that put the earth in the central place? Man's subsequent destitution from an analogous place due to the triumph of the idea of evolution gives one the sense that such revocation implies an advantage that is confirmed by its constancy. But can we be so sure that this is an advantage or real progress? Does anything make it seem that the other truth, if we may so term revelation, has seriously suffered as a result, or revealed truth instead of revelation? Don't we realize that by exalting the center, heliocentrism is no less of a lure than seeing the earth as the center, and that the existing of the ecliptic probably provided a more stimulating model of our relations with truth, before it lost much of its interest when it was reduced to being no more than the earth-bowing assent? In any case, it is not because of Darwin that men believe themselves to be any less the best among the creatures, for it is precisely of this that he convinces them. The use of Copernicus's name as a reference has more hidden resources that touch specifically on what has already just slipped from my pen regarding our relation to the true, namely the emergence of the ellipse as being not unworthy of the locus from which the so-called higher truths take their name. The revolution is no less important, even though it concerns only celestial revolutions. From that point on, to dwell on it no longer means simply revoking some idiotic notion stemming from the religious tradition, which, as can be seen well enough, is none the worse for it, but rather of tying more closely together the regime of knowledge and the regime of truth. For if Copernicus's work, as others have remarked before me, is not as Copernican as we think it is because the doctrine of double truth continues to offer shelter to a knowledge that, up until then, it must be said, appeared to be quite content with that shelter. So here we are at the palpable border between knowledge, truth and knowledge. And it might be said, after all, that at first sight, our science certainly seems to have readopted the solution of closing the border. Yet, if the history of science's birth is still a sufficiently burning question for us to be aware that at that border, something shifted at that time, it is perhaps here that psychoanalysis distinguishes itself by representing a new schism that occurred there. For let us re-examine from this angle the service we expect from Hegel's phenomenology, that of marking out an
So
ideal
it just goes
solution.
like it goes from like Copernicus as perceptual change, and then it was significant also because Galileo took it a step further, if I'm not mistaken, whereby he discovers that the Earth is like in an elliptical. He discovers elliptical. So it's like a further decentering. And then Darwin is a further decentering at the level of the species, but then Freud is a decentering at the level of the unconscious. So it's like this further interiorization of a process of decentrament. And Andrew Ellie combo.
Both of us, I think, this
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, no, this point right here is really crucial because it's like one of the things I was just thinking about with this passage is like, well, Copernicus is the like not just Darwin, but I think Copernicus is the main one that allows for like the total decentiment, to which like at the other end is Freud. Because thinking about it's like, well, who knows, maybe the theory of natural selection and ancillary to the theory of sexual selection could still operate if we return to a geocentric model where it's like with Copernicus and Galileo as the sort of final touch for the Copernican speculation, we not only have a dissentrament of the universe, but also like this sort of uncertainty that puts into question God, right? Like, does God know where the universe is going? Because maybe we're not the privileged species for Darwin, but God, encompasses all of the species. But God, it's a problem of the other, or the problem of God when it comes with Copernicus and the Galileo circuit. To which I think, like, with this sentiment, also puts into question the mastery of science, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but it also puts the question of the subject as
exactly.
such.
As such,
in,
yes.
no, in relationship to a place.
Mhm.
That's
And
the key. That's the key point.
and so the last thing that I was going to finish off with,
Like
the
a
problem of
top topography to a place.
yes,
That's
because
the key. That's the key point.
what I was about to say, since we've all read 16 and 17,
Yeah.
when he's talking about revolution,
Yeah.
and the analogy of celestial bodies,
Yeah.
if you map all the 4 discourses onto a clock, to a revolution, or the real, which returns to its place, is to
Mhm.
make a full revolution of those discourses to move back to the master's discourse, which, if you recall specifically, the core doctrine of science, or the fantasy of science, rests in the master's discourse, which is the fundamental fantasy. So this real notion of not only the birth of science, but also its sort of vicissitude, rests in that real motion.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see Jung. Jung has not been mentioned yet. Yeah. So Jung's mention here is interesting because it's kind of like a backhanded claim regarding Jung's theory of the subject of this revolution as being well, maybe like putting the subject of the imaginary at the center of it as the sort of solution is one way to say it. We'll get there in a minute. Go ahead, Luis.
Oh,
Oh,
Ellie had a question.
Oh, Ellie, sorry, my bad.
I just
I
wanted to say
I think in unity. I need to start thinking in twos. I'm sorry.
we can just join separately for a separate.
No.
No, I guess, I mean, it's perhaps kind of an obvious comment, but I think there's also something here for me in terms of this idea of like the ellipses, the revolution, like the circular motion of that, or the, the continued repetition of it, and how that relates to like the repetition compulsion as one of Freud's central ideas as well, as a way
Absolutely.
of accessing truth and knowledge.
Or even like starting the engine regarding the movement of the graph of desire itself.
True.
Decentrament, retroactivity. It puts all of those things in motion and so on. So I think that's all related as well. It was Kepler who put forward the notion of the ellipse, not the circle. Copernicus still had the circle. Sorry. Go ahead, Luis.
I think also in this, at the end of page 674, he claims, for if Copernicus' work, as others have remarked before me, is not as Copernican as we think it is because the doctrine of double truth continues to offer shelter to our knowledge that until then, it must be said, appear to be quite content with that shelter. That I think it's kind of saying that the Copernican revolution was not successful.
Right.
And I think this is very evident in, of course, the famous Copernican revolution in Kant, right? When it is completely different from what Freud is pointing out, right? Yes, there is no such an objective reality that we can have access to it, but it is a subject, the one that creates such reality, right? So there is still the idea of a unity, right? With Kant being the subject, the one that has this centrality, right? So in that case, with Kant, we can see that this knowledge still remains intact, right? The idea of unity.
Yes. And also, some interpreters have said this split, the two-ness, is the split between the subject of science and the subject of religion, which, if you read Goldman's Hidden God, he's very clear on that. as like that is what rationalism did in the history of European thought. He's way more clear than Lacan is about that. It's kind of one of those frustrating pedagogical points about Lacan that he refuses to elaborate on what he means by the double truth. But I think it will be hinted at further as we go along here. But I think you're right, which is this is not fully graspable until until Freud comes onto the scene. So yes, okay, very good. All right, shall we move then, Matan?
Or let us re-examine from the, oh, pardon me, I'm on the wrong page. Actually, where are we? Can I get a
Why
removal?
don't you go back to yet if the history of science's birth is still on 675? Might as well start there.
Yep. Yet if the history of science's birth is still a sufficiently burning question for us to be aware that at that border, something shifted at that time, it is perhaps here that psychoanalysis distinguishes itself by representing a new schism that occurred there.
Right.
Or let us
But
re-examine.
you see the point, which is psychoanalysis is making a claim about the origin of science. Freud helps us go back to the origin to discover something at the origin, is think the point, you see? So it's not like some da 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 da, and then Freud develops something new. He's like, no, it's like a new discovery about the origin of the scientific subject itself, I guess. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll be interested as we're reading to discern for myself whether this involves a mode of production as the cause or something else entirely different.
Well, I mean, what do you mean by that? Well, we already looked at that in 16 in some ways, did we not?
Yeah, yeah.
With Pascal in a certain way, right?
Well, sure. And then he also in seminar 16, it was he used surplus enjoyment rather than surplus value. So I think there's still the too much, but rather the question is now, as we went over earlier, about empiricism. In Aristotle, he has a kind of simple way of defining what units are. Units for him aren't like he's often mischaracterized as like these building blocks that we can use to assemble everything, whatever. They're always the smallest we can shrink. I don't know, our the most elementary way we can commonly communicate about something before we cannot even pretend that what we're talking about actually exists.
Huh.
So yeah. And he uses like labor, building houses and things like that as examples. And I think the Freudian insight here is to kind of like superimpose basically like the process of labor interacting with objects, or the image of that, the illustration of that, with the almost like infantile, as Andrew said earlier, the scene of maybe like a child hitting another child and saying, "Ow, you hit me," in full view of the parent, something like that.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, that's just okay.
Thank you.
Sure. I'll just continue from there.
Please.
For let us re-examine from this angle the service we expect from Hegel's phenomenology, that of marking out an ideal solution, one that involves a permanent revisionism, so to speak, in which what is disturbing about truth is constantly being reabsorbed, truth being in itself, but what is lacking in the realization of knowledge. The antinomy the scholastic tradition posited as principial is here taken to be resolved by virtue of being imaginary. Truth is nothing but what knowledge can learn that it knows, merely by putting its ignorance to work. This is a real crisis in which the imaginary is eliminated in engendering a new symbolic form, to use my own categories. This dialectic is convergent and proceeds to the juncture defined as absolute knowledge. As it is deduced, this conjuncture can only be the conjunction of the symbolic with a real from which nothing more can be expected. What is this, if not a subject finalized in his self-identity, from which one can conclude that this subject is already perfected here? It is the fundamental hypothesis of the entire process. He is named, in effect, as the substratum of this process. He is called Selbstbewussting, the being of the conscious, wholly conscious self. I should really make a point of getting some of these pronunciations right, just for the sake of not embarrassing myself before we do these. But would that it were so, but the history of science itself, I mean of our science, since its inception, assuming we situate its first birth in Greek mathematics, the history of science presents itself rather in the form of detours that comply very little with this immanentism. And scientific theories, let us not be misled on this score by any resorption of the special theory of relativity into the general theory, do not in any way fit together according to the thesis, antithesis, synthesis dialectic.
So yeah, so I guess, this thesis of what I'm interpreting as kind of like a spiritualized Hegelianism, you could even see in Nietzsche as rejected, but yet reproduced through the notion of the Übermensch as such, because it's like this non-contradictory potential of self-realization in some ways. And I think this goes to Elizabeth's hesitation, which I in solidarity with, regarding this. But let's keep in mind that Lacan's not affirming this. I think he's sort of casting it off as a degraded interpretation of Hegel that's no longer pertinent. You know what I'm saying? Apropos Matilda's hesitation regarding immanentism, I don't think the object of critique is Marxism here, Matilda. Do you? Is this where it comes in for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about like
Do you really? I mean, I don't see it.
Jameson's critique of immanentism in our last reading as like having to do with traditional Marxism.
I don't even really, I don't even know really what this is a direct reference to, frankly.
Sure. Okay.
I
think it means fully conscious, like the fully transparent, fully defined conscious self at the end of Hegel's phenomenology.
Okay, sure.
There's something that's fully symbolically defined.
Right.
Anyway, I don't know.
No, yeah, I think that is what it is. But I guess what I'm saying is like, hasn't Western philosophy or philosophy as such abandoned that premonition for quite some time? Or rather, isn't it only capable of arriving at that if you're like a theosophist or like a Jungian or like a...
What are you thinking I am? Not doing that.
or a Deleuzian,
Well, what I mean to say is like, I thought Jameson's presentation on like the impossibility of like a fully immanent position is like fairly new, he articulates it nicely and it does seem related to French philosophy's innovations. And I would have to go back to be able to replicate his argument, but
well, yeah, I mean, this is the heart of the Mirror Stage essay, right? Which is, I think, I always love that point, which is, this is a link to politics insofar as this body of the perfect subject, sort of self-transparent subject to itself, absolute knowledge subject. It was the 1936 Berlin Olympics hosted by the Nazis that Lacan wrote the Mirror Stage. And the Mirror Stage, if you're familiar with it, is this notion that subject of like a pure imaginary transparent recognition to itself, as Andrew was saying before, results in a type of internalized aggression and so on and so forth. So anyways, but the basis by which that is the case, he gets into in a moment. So I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves. Akshay, please.
I don't know if I'm right. I read this as sort of being about like Thomas Kuhn and sort of like structure of scientific revolutions. Like it felt like he was saying something around like it's the paradigmatic break is never kind of like imminent. It's not as if you have like the new paradigm sort of builds out of the presuppositions of the older paradigm, but there's like this other marginal paradigm that's been developing with a totally different set of assumptions that just like rises to dominance, right? Like, so it's not like you get ego psychology that leads into Lacan, but it's sort of, I don't know. And I mean, that's what I read by the history of science itself. So, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, well, he just refers to the scholastic tradition, and before he had talked about the two regimes of truth, right? So I think that, but then, yeah, he sets it up to deny it. But Elizabeth, please.
I want to use this as a jumping off point because I'm not a Hegelian. But my understanding of absolute knowledge, I think you're right to point to that. Lacan is like calling this into, this is a real crisis, this scholastic tradition. But does anybody else get the sense that he thinks that absolute knowing is a process of the subject? Because for Hegel, it's one of spirit, of Geist, so mind, spirit, and those are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll let people jump in on that. I mean, it's about the mediation of truth and knowledge, the split between truth and knowledge, and I think that yes, he is not referring to. Yeah, well, I don't know. What do others think? How is spirit accounted for here? I think it's this notion of substance. It's this kind of subject and substance unification at the end of the phenomenology. It's so I don't know if Luis, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to point out that, well, I think one of the best ways to understand his critique is by comparing what is his actual theory coming from, right? And what he's coming from is from linguistics. And I think we can see more clearly when he talks about synchronicity and diachronic linguistics, right? Because that's when things get more clear about how the two interact with each other, right? Because in this paragraph, what I find interesting is that he's talking about the imaginary and the symbolic, right? And he places the imaginary, and if we can think about in Hegelian dialectics, the imaginary is non-being, right? Is something false, right? And this is contrasted with being, right? And so in the dialectical process,
And
and this is
symbolic
how,
would be spirit in some sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and this is how he means that then the symbolic will eliminate the imaginary, and then we'll reach self-identity, what that is, as he understands, it will be like fully symbolic, like this. I mean, he's not clear, but we can understand it that he's kind of aiming at a complete obliteration of the imaginary, right? And of course, this comes from a reading of Hegel, from which, of course, we have Deleuze and others that reject Hegel, giving to this focus on identity, right, as being the center of absolute knowledge, right? From which there has been different critiques of, well, this is not really Hegel, right? So there's this other thing, right? The Hegel that they have in mind is very central on identity.
Well, I think other interpreters just like to reference secondary literature for a moment, which I don't like to do, in part because I use these sessions just to try to think for myself as much as possible. But I do think now that I'm looking at other commentators, I think it's also a reference to the Kojevian theory. So, insofar as Kojev puts forward the theory of the absolute subject of Hegel, and so you could say that he is speaking specifically of this and drawing a line of distinction between it and the subject of science as well. That's actually what the Pensée Tupanamba's reading of this passage suggests. Elizabeth, did you have a follow-up?
Sorry, I'm on my phone. Hard. No, I think, yeah, the new symbolic form as spirit kind of elucidated that well.
Yeah, we're going to get to the meaning of what the symbolic is.
Yeah.
Because it's not derived from Hegel. It's actually derived from Freud's conception of like the reality principle. And I think this will be elaborated on later. So, but I think that, yeah, if we want to make an analogy, I think it holds to something like that. But yeah, Jonas.
Hello. Okay, so I mean, I was thinking that maybe we could situate this as something of a critique of Marx, just generally. I don't know what he was really referring to, but we could read it that way. Where like communism is seen as like the absolute of history, you
Yeah,
know?
it's a Kojevian Marx.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. It's like a Sovietized Marx. It's that
But the Soviets thought they were scientific too. So I
Yeah.
mean, what I think is interesting in this thing is the way science and religion can kind of fit together. You know, I guess we all know this from Seminar 16, but like, oh shoot, where was it?
I know Kojev is the real Kaiser Soze of the fucking 20th century.
Right, yeah.
You know, the man in the black, like the true vanishing mediator of the universal. This like obscure esoteric bureaucrat who like opens up the end of history.
Right, yeah.
Like, you know, the Battle of Jena for Hegel is end of history. For Kojev, it's the establishment of the Stalinist bureaucracy. And of course, Milner's whole point is that Lacan has to be read almost as like in a Straussian way, as like a theory of self-censorship, because he's always trying to push back, not so much on Marxism, but on Kojev's theory in particular. But maybe you could call that Marxism too. Is that sort of what you mean though when you say Marxism? Do you kind of mean like Kojev?
Yeah, that's basically what I meant.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
But what I was thinking though is that like this is also kind of an element in an implicit element in all sciences. Maybe not necessarily you don't necessarily come to that conclusion, but every time you think of a like a theory of where you place yourself within the theory. So like psychology in particular, you're always implicitly thinking, I am a subject, or in sociology, I am a social being. You don't say it outright, but that's going to affect the count of what you're trying to look at objectively. You're kind of always twisted within that. And that just the ideal or the maximizing of that, you know, or that science has a similar maximum, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, if you read Kojev's introductions to the reading of phenomenology, he doesn't play with that stupid like AI Hegel of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. No. For him, it's like all like negativity and determinate negation and negation of negation and so on. And like, you know what I'm saying? I don't even think that I mean, yeah, he sort of is a thinker of the end of history though. At the same time, it's a really interesting. I love his introductions to the lectures on Hegel are really spectacular. But they're far more open than what is being portrayed here. I think what is being portrayed here is this thing that Zizek always does as well, where it's like, oh, people have a reading of Hegel. But it's like, no, actually, people don't have that reading of Hegel. Like, somewhere somebody said that they do, but I don't know who that person is. And go ahead, Matilda.
Yeah, I feel like that like the antinomy of the scholastics was like they held apart truth and knowledge, like truth. There was like a transcendent element of like what was true and it was received and given. And they held that antinomy to be like eternal or whatever. Whereas with Hegel, it seems like there is like a progression towards a rational society in his work. And I could see that as being like the subject of science, and Hegel is like the subject of a subject of a society that knows it's rational.
Yeah.
And like there's like in Hegel, like in the science of logic, all of that's like the progress of like Kant's categories. He like basically like generates them like in like a logical history. And I could see how like the full unfolding of like the logical scientific subject where like all of the categories of Kant are finally like developed could be like a fully scientific subject in some way.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. So we have the subject of science. We have the scholastic division, which is actually part of the subject of science. We have the Hegelian subject of absolute knowledge. And now I think we are building into the Freudian subject from this. Yes, both bigs,
Big
the big
alien, big
SIGs.
sig.
You got to help me with the
Like,
nickname.
no,
she doesn't.
that's not a good one.
You got to help me, help
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, I wanted to add that, like, because the question concerning what is the symbolic defined as
Yeah,
in here, but also Milner
in Hegel, or yeah,
or in Lacan, really.
mhm.
But I think like more like because Milner was invoked, and he says something interesting about the two classicisms in his work on Lacan, and that the first classicism for Lacan is evoked primarily because of the writing of the Ecrit. And what that means is that, of course, he's situated around structural linguistics. But if there's anything that isn't clearly distinguished between Lacan of that first classicism, which is pretty much seminar 1 all the way up to, like, I think 16, I think, and then 16 all the way up to 20, it would be the fact that he doesn't distinguish the signifier from the letter, right? And so to bring it back to what the symbolic is, it's not just that it's signifiers, but that it's the counting and numeration and combinatory logic of that. And why this has to do with what we've been talking about is because we should think of knowledge insofar as that it could be combined with any sort of theory or concept that the subject of science is trying to quantify, enumerate in the field of the other, right? The field of the other is the locus of signifiers, and that is whatever the subject of science is trying to intervene, because it is also the subject of the signifier, right? That is what the subject of science that's split by knowledge and truth, which is the psychoanalytic subject at the same time, is intervened by the signifier. It remains absent from its own investigation, but it is represented through the field of knowledge, right? Trying to aim at truth. So I think maybe that can bring some clarity.
It does. No, we haven't gotten to that development yet, but that's absolutely.
Yeah, and I just bring that in because I know we've been through 16 and 17, so I don't have to like worry about the terms like, oh, am I assuming an audience? I know we've all like
long.
So yeah, we
all. Akshay, and then we will get back to reading, please.
The other word I want to throw out is like humanism, or I guess anti-humanism. Like, I mean, in the sense that I think the whole discussion with like Copernicus, it's sort of what constitutes like the real death of God. So say you have a death of God, but then you get Feuerbach that like puts the human in the place of God. And I guess the word I was thinking about is like humiliation, because it is about like what is a discourse that sort of like humiliates the subject. And if we're thinking about like religious discourse, it's like the sort of like veneration, that something about the truth is like beautiful, that like it inspires reverence, piety, it fits with knowledge, right? Like unity in that way. And like all of these like elevations of the human restore God, in the sense of like, whereas I think like he's saying Hegel isn't quite this, because Hegel isn't in this thesis and this way like he isn't saying you have progress. There are things that are sort of like forgotten, right? Like, I don't know. So but I just wanted to throw out anti-humanism, because I feel like that's kind of getting to a lot of what's going on here with the Copernicus stuff.
Yes, thank you very much.
A little bit more on that point real quick.
Sure.
I think it was Hegel. I mean, I don't remember, but someone was saying something that like the morning prayer was replaced by the morning newspaper.
Right, that's
same
Hegel.
activity, but it's exchanged horizontally, not like vertically. There's not like an ascension to another state. And science does this, like we go from one model that is everything to another model that is everything. Or even in like, I mean, if I can go back to Darwin real quick, the people who are saying that like oh, we're not descended from monkeys. You could have the same, like there's this kind of eugenic racism going on there. But now you have someone who's a Darwinist who says, yeah, because Darwin says so, we're the dominant species, it's that same horizontal exchange,
Brilliant. I love this, guys. I love this. He's saying so little, but we bring so much. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I also like that we're going so slow, like turtles. That's how it should be. And I do mean it that the break will have to happen at 7:45. Will you be upset if that happens? Because I can also do something where I like give my hosting privileges to someone else and you guys can just keep on going and then I can listen later. No? Oh, that is adorable. Okay, let us go. Matan, would that it were so. Could you start there? People don't say that phrase anymore. Like my grandparents used to say that phrase. That's a cool phrase to say. We should resurrect that phrase. Would that were it so. Go on.
Would that word so? Where's that? I thought we just finished antithesis, synthesis, dialectic, but I happened to
Oh
just.
yeah, I was asking you to reread it. Sorry.
Oh no, but okay, that is the beginning of that paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
sorry.
Yeah.
Oh no, I don't mind whatsoever. Would that it
You know
were
what?
so.
One thing I want to say, guys. You know, I'm trying to do this thing this summer. I'm trying to memorize Shakespearean sonnets as an act of like memory strength. Has anyone ever tried to do that before? You have? Yeah. I'm working on it. It's hard, but it's actually like fun because it's like this like weird. It's like learning to play the piano. That same kind of like, oh my God, that's a muscle I've never used before. Um, I'll send you guys in the Discord if you want to do that. Maybe we could have a session where we practice it. Anyways, okay, go on, please.
Oh no, methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell that is a good idea.
Look at that. Look
Yeah.
at that. Look at that.
Would that it were so.
I'm not surprised that you are of that nature. Why do you think you're reading, comrade? Come on now.
Would that it were so. But the history of science itself, I mean of our science since its inception, assuming we situate its first birth in Greek mathematics, presents itself rather, pardon me, in the form of detours that comply very little with this immanentism. And scientific theories, let us not be misled on this score by any resorption of the special theory of relativity into the general theory, do not in any way fit together according to the thesis, antithesis, synthesis dialectics. Indeed, a number of creeks, confusedly given voice to by the great minds responsible for some of the cardinal changes in physics, remind us that, after all, it is elsewhere that the moment of truth must sound for this field of knowledge as for others. Why wouldn't we think that the astonishing indulgence science is showing toward psychoanalytic hype may be due to the theoretical hope psychoanalysis offers, a hope that is not merely the result of the prevailing confusion. I'm not, of course, referring to the extraordinary lateral transference by which psychology reimmerses its categories in psychoanalysis to reinvigorate its lowly purposes of social exploitation. For the reason already stated, I regarded the fate of psychology as irremediably sealed. Okay. In any case, my two-pronged reference to Hegel's absolute subject and to science's abolished subject sheds the light necessary to accurately formulate Freud's dramatism, the return of truth to the field of science at the same time as it comes to the fore in the field of its praxis. Repressed, it reappears there. Who cannot see the distance that separates the unhappiness of consciousness, which, however deeply ingrained it may be in Hegel's work, can still be said to be but the suspension of knowing, from civilization's discontents in Freud's work, even if it is only in the inspiration of a sentence which is, as it were, disavowed, that Freud marks for us what, on reading it, cannot be articulated otherwise than the skewed relation that separates the subject from sex. There is nothing, then, in my approach to situating Freud that owes anything to the judicial astrology in which the psychologist is immersed. Nothing that proceeds on the basis of quality, much less of intensity, or of any phenomenology from which idealism may draw reassurance. In the Freudian field, the words notwithstanding, consciousness is a characteristic that is as obsolete to us In grounding the unconscious, for we cannot ground it on the negation of consciousness, that unconscious dates back to St. Thomas Aquinas. In grounding the unconscious as affect is unsuited to play the role of the protopathic subject, since it is a function without a functionary. Starting with Freud, the unconscious becomes a chain of signifiers that repeats and insists somewhere, on another stage or in a different scene, as he wrote, interfering in the cuts offered it by actual discourse and the cogitation it informs. In this formulation, which is mine only in the sense that it conforms as closely to Freud's text as to the experience they opened up, the crucial term is the signifier, revived from ancient rhetoric by modern linguistics, in a doctrine whose various stages I cannot trace here, but of which the names Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jakobson stand for its dawn and its present-day culmination, not forgetting that the pilot science of structuralism in the West has its roots in Russia, where formalism first flourished. In Geneva in 1910 and Petrograd in 1920, suffice to explain why Freud did not have this particular instrument at his disposal, but this historically motivated lacuna makes all the more instructive the fact that the mechanisms described by Freud as those of the primary process by which the unconscious is governed correspond exactly to the functions this school of linguistics believes determine the most radical axes of the effects of language, namely metaphor and metonymy. In other words, the effects of the substitution and combination of signifiers in the synchronic and diachronic dimensions, respectively, in which they appear in discourse. Yes, Luis?
Yeah, so in the previous page, when he was talking about science and praxis, and given the fact that this was written just at the end of Seminar 7, at the end of Seminar 7, he referenced the science and he talks about Oppenheimer as an example of how scientists need to be, as is well known, they foreclose, right, truth. And it's in this case that Oppenheimer, for example, creates he develops the atom bomb, and from which then he becomes guilty, right? And this guilt, the return of the repressed, right? From which, as he says in the middle, there is something there is still written, right? It insists somewhere, right? And this is the symptom, right? And in the case of Oppenheimer, right, from which scientists need to repress, right, to create a cohesive, objective reality. They need to repress the unconscious drives of sexuality, right? Nonetheless, this unhappiness in society somewhere still written, somewhere still palpable, right? And I think that's what is at stake, and what it is noticeable in linguistics, right? And that's where we're going now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now we have the proper name. You are the not to. The not to. Let's go to the not to.
Yeah. She
How
just
about that?
Yeah, she just left to the bathroom right now, so it's
Okay.
just Yad Leon, something of the one.
It'll work. No, it'll
Yeah.
work. I'm just gonna call you
It's
that from now
the
on.
not to.
The not to. The not to.
She's coming right now. But yeah, now that we're on the structural linguistics thing, I think one of the cool things that Matan pointed out when we started this was reading the preface and how the graph of desire, which we're about to get into, was created based upon his reading of Der Witz, of the jokes, but also as what he literally just points out right here about the synchronic and diachronic dimension that correspond with metaphor and metonymy.
Yes.
And so that should be something that like we should foreshadow.
Yeah.
Also, Luis pointed out that this was written after Seminar 7, but this was also written 3 years after his big essay that's also in the decree, Agency of the Letter, to really defend what he means by the signifier. Luis also posted in the Discord a really good text from Philippe Lecula-Barth and Luke Nancy on the letter of that essay. But I think Lacan's point about the signifier is that it doesn't refer to things but it relies on signification from another signification because of the anarchy of the signifier over the signified binary. But with that, we get a new law of motion with the signifier because of its reign or anarchy, as Milner uses, over this signified relationship, because it's of signification. And we see like how that operates within the graph of desire. Like the graph of desire is not only trying to locate desire, but it's like formations of the unconscious, which is the signifier's operation based on metaphor, metonymy, and punctuation, scansion, etc. So I just wanted to throw that out there now that we're getting into Jakobson and Saussure.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. So we went from like these three movements of historical decentrament to the notion that the Freudian intervention um, defines something regarding the origin of the subject of science, and that it finds its place in language, specifically in the signifier, but then the subject's relationship to that signifier has both a synchronic and diachronic relation. And then he introduces metaphor and metonymy, but then obviously, as we know, Lacan still relies on those concepts, and we can define them in a moment. I think that they are definitely essential, but I think we should wait until this a little bit further to go into that. Matilda.
Yeah, I think we should also have in mind here, like how another element within Lacan's thinking is like the axiomatic method, and how like a mathematical system can never be complete. And in contradistinction to how like Hegel operates towards this like fully conscious position, or in this paragraph that has like there is nothing situating Freud that owes anything to a psychologist.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Very good point.
The unconscious is not the opposite of consciousness, because consciousness is an affect in Lacan's thinking. And this point about an affect is unsuited to play the role of the protopathic subject, since it is a function without a functionary, and that the unconscious becomes a chain of signifiers. And in 16, it's very clear that like the chain of signifiers is reduced to like this mathematical scientific tradition that he evoked right after the Hegel passage, and that within that tradition is the axiomatic form of demonstrating things, and a total system within that form of thinking is impossible due to like the Gödel theorems of incompleteness and inconsistency. So in that sense, we're barred from a totally transparent subject. But also I wanted to just, the functionary without a function did remind me of thank God for Poland, because without Poland, there wouldn't be Polish people. Anyway, something maybe to meditate on is like an answer to that puzzle in the Kant Avak piece. I don't want to keep us too long.
No, that's a great reference, Matilda. Thank you. Excellent.
If I can.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, because in that sense is the function without functionary, right? In the sense that there can be an impulse without even you be conscious of it, right? Although in this case of the imperative, there is a match, right, between your unconscious desire, right, for being loyal to Poland, and the statement, right, of long live Poland, right? But there is no necessary match between the two, but there is something we're talking about the enunciation and the enunciated, right?
Yeah, we're almost there.
Can I just say one thing about, I really like what Matilda said about consciousness and unconsciousness. They're not the oppositions at all. Like, you're totally right. And that goes down between what you pointed out, Matilda, is that the signifier is what we're talking about with the unconscious, the subject of the signifier. Like since we read Jameson, the gray must swear, right? So if anything, the unconscious is it the contrary of consciousness, or maybe to be more Lacanian, the exception, right? The exception of consciousness, because the opposite of consciousness would just be non-consciousness, right? And that's it's going to the rules of the signifier, and it's negation, annihilation, and differentiation and difference. So consciousness is, or unconscious would be the difference and exception to consciousness that Lacan is getting at.
Okay, excellent. All right, now things get heavy and a little bit more challenging. I feel like the essay is not really starting because he's introducing this notion of the erasure of the I and all of that. Please.
Once the structure of language is recognized in the unconscious, what sort of subject can we conceive of for it? In a concern for method, we can try to begin here with the strictly linguistic definition of I as signifier, where it is nothing but the shifter or indicative that, as grammatical subject of the statement, designates the subject insofar as he is currently speaking. That is to say, it designates the enunciating subject, but does not signify him. This is obvious from the fact that there may be no signifier of the enunciating subject in the statement, not to mention that there are signifiers that differ from I, and not only those that are inadequately called cases of the first person singular, even if we add that it can be lodged in the plural invocation or even in the self of autosuggestion. I believe, for example, that I have detected the enunciating subject in the French signifier ne, said by grammarians to be expletive, a term that already prefigures the incredible opinion of those among the best who regard its form as subject to sheer whimsy. Would that the weight I give it make them think twice, before it not but become obvious they have missed the point. Take out that, not but, ne, and my enunciation loses its force as an attack. I alighting me in the impersonal. Actually, I think this, does anyone have the translation of the sentence right here? Pardon the wait, I have a little camera translator here. I'm just gonna use that quickly. This isn't working. Okay. I think the sentence is like, he cannot help but, or something. You know what, never mind. I'm gonna explain this poorly, so I'm just gonna continue. But if I say to kill because they are killing me, where am I situating myself if not in the to on the basis of which I glare at them? Actually, could I pause things for a second just so we can get that translation? Because I do think that's kind of important right here. Hold on, sorry about that.
I think that's the translation, yet I fear that in this way they could not but come.
Oh, they could not, yeah, they could not come, but yeah, you're completely
I think
correct.
it's provided,
Ellie pulled out the translation. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I can play it for you. That would.
No, I think Luis pointed out that he actually does repeated the sentence after, and I just wasn't aware.
he repeats
does.
it. Yeah.
So here he says,
But
"Yet I
I mean-
fear." Oh, please, yeah.
No, I mean the thing is that there is no translation for the ne, right? And that's a problem, right? Only in French you have the ne,
Right.
because it's. I mean, yeah, it doesn't work.
Akshay?
I think it connects to what Andrew was saying a second ago about difference, right? Like sort of, I mean, and because like the whole, I was reading the book Luis posted in the Discord, the Jean-Luc Nancy one. It's really clear, and I mean the basic thesis is sort of that that Lacan wants to get rid of the theory of the subject and replace it with the theory of the letter, right? And the whole idea being that if the sign represents something to someone, that the signifier is rather like pure difference. And like, right, in the question he's asking here, where he asks like, I don't know, I mean, something along like, where am I in the fact of speaking? And that where I am is the part of my speech that's signifier, the part that like signifies difference, right? Like it, and so the na as like this like purely untranslatable, this like little whimsical excess, that like it stands for that precisely that difference that like kind of in the but yeah, I mean, and I think anyway, I'll stop. Go ahead, Mathilda.
I just wanted to try to get the distinction down here. So we have the I as like a special signifier index. It has like a dual function. And from what I understand, like there is so there's a statement, which is like a complete sentence. And so to read the I within a sentence, the I is a signifier of the grammatical subject. But in the uttering of a sentence, while it's being uttered, or enunciation, the I functions as an index of the subject, but not a signifier of it. I'm not exactly sure what the distinction is there between these two things, but when he moves on to talk about the na, he says he's detected the enunciating subject, which the I could not signify. So in the enunciating subject, the difficulty is finding a signifier for that subject, because the I in the enunciating is only a designator or an index of it. But he seems to be able to detect the signifier of the enunciating subject in these different negations and different slips and different forms in the like the between said, perhaps. I think the question is here is like, how do we what is the difference in these functions, and why is it important to determine a signifier of the subject of the unconscious?
Luis.
So I like to make a differentiate the two following Kant's difference between the transcendental subject and the empirical subject, right? Because in that way we can see how the transcendental subject is the I of a perception, the I that is simply has a logical function, right? While the empirical subject is subject of let's say the body of the phenomena, right? In the way that is a subject that speaks, right? Of course, it's not the same logic, but there is already a difference there, a split, right, between the I that is a grammatical subject that synthesizes the whole sentence, let's say, and the subject that speaks. But now the thing about the enunciation is that for psychoanalysis, then there is no negation in the unconscious, right? So, and a statement that in French that uses the ne, that there is a negation, but it doesn't work like a negation, right? It's very particular, and it's interesting that why would you use that negation, right? And well, and this comes to the idea that, for example, when you say, "Oh, this is not my mother," right? You're actually talking about your mother, right? And comes the idea that all the statements that we negate, there is no such negation in the unconscious, right? So it comes to that, right? That the fact that speech is the speech, the enunciation is not goes beyond what I can understand in the statement, right? What I in my understanding using Kant's categories, right? In my understanding, I can synthesize, right? Speech goes beyond that. And I think that's what's at stake here.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. The nut too?
Yeah, to add on to what Luis is saying, because I think it's important with the, not only what Luis added, but Matilda's speculations, because it's important that the grammatical I, this pronoun, this shifter, is only but a designation of the subject, but it doesn't signify, which means to be technical at first, but to get to my point, the technical part is that a signifier not only refers its meaning to another signifier, the battery bank, but it also represents the subject because the subject is absent. And in fact, the signifier engenders absence. but this grammatical I, the shifter that designates or is indexical of the subject, is not one that actually, in a sense, is stand-in for absence, but what it's doing is a sort of, in the speech act, inaugurating of differentiation, because Lacan has said this since seminars 1, 2, and 3, when he talks so much about speech and the I, that the I is an other. So to be able to say I in a statement is to be able to evoke an other and differentiate the other that you're addressing or speaking to from yourself, right? And this has
kind of in the sense that like the I is made up of these imaginary identifications through the mirror stage.
Yes, and in the instance of speaking, this has a lot of clinical effects, because you'll get a neurotic patient who's very much invested of like what they don't like, what they hate, how much they hate their mother, their father, etc. And the eye of the statement sort of vanishes in moments of like, it was terrible, or the world is in chaos because people are poor, which is actually, in this punctual moment, an intervention for the analyst, because really the reality, based upon what the analytic or the analysand has said, up until this point, is like how much they are not this or they hate this, but then they say the world and people, when really they mean that my world is in chaos because I am poor, but yet the I of the statement was absent. To kind of cap off my point, look at the famous example of a child is being beaten. That is a neutral statement where the I is not there, or the subject is sort of a neutral, vanishing point in that, because you could have many aspects of that. I am the child being beaten, or I am beating the child. But in this instance, a child is being beaten is where the I of the statement is not there, but yet there is an enunciation that is happening at the level of the enunciation versus the enunciated. So I think this is a perfect thing to really elaborate on, and how the I operates, not only in the saying the I, but also in the you and the thou, which differentiates that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, guys. So we have the subject of this statement that is marked by an I, which is just of a pure sort of basic linguistic shifter. And this subject of the statement is sort of locatable within the syntax of the sentence. And then we have the subject of enunciation, which sort of disappears or is rendered absent or empty based upon the grammatical distortions and the signifier itself. So it's almost like the one that really matters for us is the subject of enunciation. And I have questions about how these two levels map onto the symbolic and the imaginary, or not, but we're not quite there yet. I think a useful exercise for us would be to think of examples of sentences that demonstrate these two levels. Like Andrew just shared one of a child is being beaten, but I think that there's also a likeliness that in analysis, when an analysand is speaking and they have uttered a sentence where they have removed the I, but the I is still in the subject of the sentence, I think perhaps that might be an example of this. That's actually what Sam McCormick was suggesting in his lecture on this, and I found that actually pretty useful. In other words, it's like the subject of enunciation is also a subject which is riddled by the real. Go ahead. Did you guys have another comment?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, I guess to your point, like it makes me think about even my analytic session this morning, and how like I was being very emphatic about a point that I was trying to make. And after a certain point in like my speech, I was shifting from I this, or like my family this, to like a more general, it was actually second person you, like, or one might, do X, Y, and Z, or like my experience of versus like a more general, I was talking about ultimatums and saying like, you know, ultimatums are typically a person has a desired outcome of an ultimatum in a very broad sense, as opposed to like, you know, my mom has a desired outcome of an ultimatum, for example.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I've had an experience where there was a subject of enunciation versus the enunciated, where in that entire session, you know, I had said I this or he or she say this, and then at a specific moment, I said it didn't happen, right? Where there was no sort of personal pronoun or a pronoun addressing the other or a group or whatever. It was just indexed by it was not such and such, and Richard was just like, it's interesting how the subject is absent in this. What do you make of that? Because in this entire session, you've literally have said like, you know, you don't like that. This person does this and that to you, and you don't like this and that, and either, and you've made these distinctions between yourself and them, but then in this precise moment, you say it, right? And so these are examples in which the subject of the statement or the enunciated I can sort of vanish, right? Oh, you're muted, Daniel.
It's like the subject of enunciation betrays itself,
right?
in a certain way.
And you mentioned Sam. Sam makes this distinction because he's been reading the Atodi of there's a distinction between the saying and what is said, and it's almost like there's a betrayal between these two. So like,
right,
what the saying matters more than what is said.
Yes, thank you guys so much for that. Luis, please.
Yeah, I also point out that in enunciation is not just this aspect of speech, but the speech as a whole, like an embodiment, right? Because it doesn't go without being said, right? And this comes precisely in the case of symptoms, like someone that, I don't know, has a certain pain on a hand, right? And there is this hysterical symptomatology, right? There is something that has been said with that symptom, right? And which of course is not being symbolized, it's not being enunciated at the level of speech, right? But there is also this level of something that is, it doesn't go without being said, right? And this is also something that needs to be analyzed, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's I always wonder about this in relationship to oratory, or even like Socrates, insofar as how is oracular speech to be mapped? I mean, it's clearly an example, I would assume, of the signifier working through the body, i.e., it's an example of the subject of enunciation. But what I find so interesting about that is that it's the whole like discourse of Socrates is premised on the fulfillment of the oracles, of therefore of the signifiers demand that's put on the subject. And then you notice that if you ever teach philosophy, like when I taught in the prison, one of the most excellent experiences is to fully submit yourself to the spontaneity of your own enunciation without any awareness of like really a plan or what's coming. It's just like you just throw yourself to the battery of signifiers and you go like that. That to me is doing philosophy in a certain way, entering into like a free association. And I think that the method of free association and the Socratic method are so intertwined in that regard, you know? Because that's the other thing is like, how does this the subject of the statement appear in analysis? Anyways, these are general questions, but I think we should probably continue. Oh yeah, we're over time. Son of a dang. Well, what should
It
we
was
do?
getting good.
I know, we were just warming up, damn it.
I mean,
All
maybe we should scansion it.
Hey,
Yeah,
time's
yeah,
up,
yeah.
time's up, time's up.
Time's up. Yeah, no, Matilda, thank you.
Hey.
Yes.
was it do Lacan when he has his hand out for the payment? It's like
Something like that. Okay, fabulous. Great. I'm already looking forward to next Thursday. I hope everyone can make it on the 10th, and we will jump immediately in, and we will get to graph 1 and possibly beyond, maybe even to graph 2. But this is amazing. This is truly great. Do you guys think that maybe Matilda, we could chat about whether we should publish our Lacan with Sod sessions? I don't see why not. But then also Matilda has been organizing our even past sessions that we haven't published, so we can chat about how that's coming along as well.